Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to briefly analyze how Bernardo Silva's positional adjustment played a key role in the main tactical theme in Arsenal's narrow Charity Shield triumph over Man City. So in today's video, first we'll focus on how both sides look to attack, then we'll shift to Arsenal's pressing, and lastly we'll analyze Guardiola's second half tactical adjustment. So when we break it all down and we do look at the board, we have Arsenal in a 4-3-3 and Man City in a variation of a 4-2-3-1 that at times could be a 4-4-2. Due to Alvarez's positioning. So when we look how both sides look to set up, there was no real surprises from Arsenal in terms of how they were lining up. The only real tactical shift was Havertz playing up front, but Havertz has the capability of playing in that center forward role that Mikel Arteta demands, as he's capable of dropping off deeper to serve as an outlet and overload that midfield area, but he could also make runs into the channels and serve as an aerial threat. Saka and Martinelli were hugging the touchline initially, and then in that midfield zone, it was Odegaard pushing a bit higher, Rice dropping off into that inside left position, but at times pushing forward, and that would vary the positioning of Timber, and Martinelli would often hug the touchline as expected. Essentially, that makes it 3v3 in that midfield zone. It'd be Alvarez against Thomas-Partey, Odegaard against Kovacic, and then Rodri against Rice. City, on the other hand, had Alvarez a bit closer to Haaland in the early stages, and then out in the wider areas, both Grealish and Bernardo Silva were hugging the touchline to stretch the pitch. You have Akanji and Walker out in that fullback role, and Akanji was often holding a narrow position as he was tasked with dealing with Bukayo Saka, and there were rare occasions where you ended up seeing Walker pushing forward beyond Martinelli, and he was looking to join the overlap with Bernardo Silva rather than Akanji, who did hold his position and occasionally push forward, and we'll get to that in a bit. With City expected to dominate possession throughout this match, the main tactical theme was always going to surround how Arsenal would look to disrupt them, and they did a very good job of ensuring that City couldn't create countless chances, and it stemmed with their pressing from the front. What we ended up seeing was that they had Havertz and Odegaard pushing forward, and the main premise here was to ensure that Kovacic and Rodri couldn't get on the ball. What you ended up seeing was that Havertz was stepping towards John Stones to ensure that he couldn't push forward, and Ruben Diaz was left as the spare man, as you ended up seeing Odegaard and Rice closing down Rodri and Kovacic on a consistent basis. Because Alvarez was pushed a bit higher up the pitch, the center backs were tasked with going 2v2 in that zone, and ThomasPartey was often the free man, and you'd expect him to close down one of the spare central midfielders if Odegaard and Rice looked to help Havertz. Martinelli and Saka dealt with Akanji and Walker, and at the time when Ruben Diaz did receive the ball, that's when you would see Odegaard pushing forward to close him down, and he'd block off the passing lane in towards Kovacic. From there, you could expect ThomasPartey to push forward, but because Odegaard did a very good job of blocking off that passing lane, ThomasPartey often held his position just in case Alvarez dropped deeper and one of the center backs didn't track his movement. There was also the occasion where if Odegaard stepped towards Ruben Diaz, then you'd see Rice shifting laterally to deal with Kovacic and then force City center backs to play the ball in the center of the pitch to the unmarked Rodri, but they often reverted from doing that. So for large spells of that opening half, it was Odegaard and Rice pressing Kovacic and Rodri out of the game, and then doing a very good job of stepping towards Ruben Diaz and blocking off the passing lane towards Kovacic, and Havertz was often swarming Stones if he attempted to push forward. Now, the manner in which City were able to bypass that press stemmed from Rodri dropping in towards his own defensive line to get on the ball, and from there he could play the ball out into wider areas, and there were times where you ended up seeing Odegaard and Havertz dropping off and blocking off the passing lane in towards one of those midfielders, and from there if Rodri stepped in towards the defensive line, he was able to get on the ball, and that's where you would see him playing diagonal balls out into towards the wider areas where he'd look to pick out Akanji or Walker running off Martinelli and Saka, and that did happen on a few occasions, or you'd see him shifting out the ball towards Bernardo Silva and Grealish, who were hugging the touchline. The same thing was applicable for the center backs, especially when one of Kovacic or Rodri dropped in towards the defensive line, and there were times where Havertz and Odegaard were simply retreating in towards their position in a 4-4-2, and that's where you would see Stones and Ruben Diaz having a bit of time to step in towards the midfield zone and play diagonal balls out in towards the wider areas. But for the most part, when they dropped off in towards that base shape, if Alvarez wasn't dropping off into that midfield zone, they would often have a 4v2 around Kovacic and Rodri, and they struggled to get the ball in that midfield area with time, and that often led to a disconnect between the midfield and the front front two. The other manner in which they could revert into that 4-4-2 would simply being having Havertz and Odegaard just ahead of Rodri and Kovacic, and then you would see ThomasPartey and Rice blocking off the passing lane in towards Alvarez, who was looking to drop off into that midfield zone. And then if Akanji and Walker were pushing forward to stretch the pitch, it would be Martinelli and Saka in narrow positions prepared to shift out to close them down. And then equally, there were times where Odegaard would step towards Ruben Diaz, and because Stones wasn't positioned to get on the ball, if it was Kovacic that was free and Odegaard couldn't completely block off the passing lane, it'd be Havertz dropping off deeper to pick up the spare man in that midfield zone. In many ways, Arsenal's initial approach was positive, and there were even times where you simply had Havertz blocking off the passing lane in towards Stones, and that would be when Ortega was on the ball, and you'd have Odegaard and Rice blocking off the passing lane in towards that midfield area, and if the ball was shifted out towards Diaz, then that's where you could see Odegaard pushing forward to close him down. So ultimately, there were two ways that City were bypassing that Arsenal shape. It was either Rodri, Kovacic, or one of the center backs or the goalkeeper getting on the ball and playing the diagonal balls out and towards the wider areas. It was Rodri in particular picking out the sharp runs of Kovacic off of Odegaard's shoulder in towards pockets of space, and from there Kovacic was able to get himself into good positions, but they often didn't lead to goal scoring opportunities. This ultimately called for a tactical shift from Guardiola. You ended up seeing Alvarez now dropping off a bit deeper in towards that midfield zone and forcing ThomasPartey to track his movement, and while that did separate the gap between Alvarez and Haaland, what you ended up seeing was that now City were able to overload that midfield zone, because not only did Alvarez drop off deeper, you ended up seeing Bernardo Silva shifting away from that touchline position and dropping off in towards that midfield zone to make it a 4v3. Timber wasn't following him in towards that zone, and neither were any of the wide players initially. And now when City were looking to build out of the back, although Rodri and Kovacic were taken out of the game, when the center backs were able to get on the ball, Bernardo Silva was now attracting markers towards him, and that created an avenue for Alvarez to receive the ball freely. And then if they weren't playing the ball in towards Alvarez, it was Bernardo Silva receiving the ball in that central area, and from there you would now see Kyle Walker have the capability of pushing forward to stretch the pitch down that side and peg back Martinelli. In many cases, you wouldn't see ThomasPartey stepping towards Bernardo Silva, and if Declan Rice was now stepping towards Bernardo Silva, that would leave Rodri free to receive the ball in the gap between Saka and Odegaard, or Odegaard and Havertz, as Havertz was focused on the center back and Odegaard was still tracking the movement of Kovacic. And even in the final third around the Arsenal penalty area, if Bernardo Silva received the ball in tight spaces and dragged out Timber, he still had the capability of dragging markers towards him and sliding the ball out and towards dangerous areas for his attacking teammates to get on the ball. There were times where you ended up seeing Bernardo Silva dragging Martinelli in towards a central area. He was dragging away Rice in towards zones where Rice didn't want to track him in towards, and from there he was creating space for his teammates to get on the ball. And then there were simply situations where he was running off markers in towards pockets of space to receive the ball from his teammates and help Man City retain possession, but also helping them push forward to apply pressure to the Arsenal backline. In many of those scenarios, he was popping up into pockets of space to receive the ball. Walker was pushing forward down the right touchline, and now you were constantly seeing Rodri have an outlet to pick out diagonal balls beyond Martinelli to place Walker into advanced positions in the final third, and it was Walker's repetitive advanced movement beyond Martinelli that played a key role in City's opener. So in several scenarios within a 15 to 20 minute period, it was Bernardo Silva popping up into that midfield zone and either occupying opposing Arsenal midfielders to create space for his teammates to receive the ball and bypass that Arsenal shape, or he was popping up into that space to receive the ball and help City push forward to bypass what was a successful press in the opening stages of that game. Ultimately, Guardiola's substitutions after that did halt City's dominance within that period. Initially, you saw Phil replace Grealish, and then there was a change where you ended up seeing De Bruyne and Cole Palmer come onto the field, and it was Bernardo Silva dropping off in towards that midfield zone along Rodri, and that also shifted his impact. And while it did look like Palmer would hug the touchline along with Phil, what ended up happening was that as that game continued with Alvarez pushing up front beyond De Bruyne, now you ended up seeing De Bruyne dropping off into the space on the outside of ThomasPartey to receive the ball, and Phil and Palmer were tucking in towards pockets of space to overload that center of the pitch, and now you ended up seeing Akanji and Walker pushing forward forward down the touchline. There were still situations where De Bruyne's appreciation of space and Phil's vertical movement allowed Bernardo Silva to step in towards pockets of space to retain possession. But for the most part, what we ended up seeing now was that when City had possession, you had De Bruyne, at times Alvarez, Bernardo, and Palmer tucking into pockets of space in that midfield zone, dominating the center of the pitch, and now there were several outlets for City's center backs and Rodri to play into, and they were able to bypass that Arsenal shape to push forward, and now City were starting to create better chances and get themselves into legitimate goal scoring positions. Ultimately, when you break down City's opener, it's Bernardo Silva dropping off deeper towards the penalty area as Ruben Dias was on the ball. You could see Rodri's taken out of the game, but that's where you now see Phil dropping off and towards that midfield zone. The first line of the press is bypassed, and you see Phil dragging away ThomasPartey, spinning across him on the half turn, and now being able to break forward to lead the counterattack. And as you watch that play develop, that counterattack stems with the ball being switched out towards Palmer, and that's where you see Walker making the overlapping run as he was doing on a consistent basis because Martinelli wasn't tracking it. And from there, you ended up seeing him pulling away two markers in Gabriel and Tierney towards him because they were scared of the pass being played into right half space, and that created enough space for Palmer to get the ball on towards his left foot to put City ahead. So as you can see, although Arsenal pressed well in the opening half and were ultimately winners on the day, it's key to note that Guardiola's adjustment in the midfield zone tilted the pattern of the match into Man City's favor, and in many ways they were unfortunate to lose here.